You might have heard about a big international conference centered around the climate change happening in Scotland right now. President Joe Biden was just there. World leaders from across the globe there as well. So to talk about this and why we should be paying attention to it, we have Patrick Gallagher joining us now for our KSAT Q&A, UTSA Assistant Professor of Anthropology. Thank you so much for being here. Let's talk about this conference. What is it and what is the purpose behind it?
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is the big, usually annual conference that the United Nations holds with all of the countries that are party to the big conventions on climate change and that have signed on to agreements, global agreements about some of the changes that they'll make to reduce carbon emissions and to hopefully stave off some of the worst impacts of climate change. So in Glasgow right now, there are over 200 countries and their representatives gathered together. And more than just the 200 countries, there's representatives from private industry, from religious groups, from nonprofits, all indigenous activist groups who have come together to have this conversation about what's the state of the knowledge on climate change, what kinds of adaptations, what kinds of changes are we going to have to make to meet some of the goals of reducing emissions and reducing some of the worst impacts of climate change. So they're gathering in Glasgow to have this really kind of big, messy, multilateral conversation. And it's a big meeting because they're revisiting for the first time really some of the goals that were set in the Paris Accords back in 2015 when they had the meetings in Paris and set some new goals for hopefully keeping global warming to a global average of 1.5 degrees Celsius, which many climate scientists feel is the kind of threshold at which there would be much more serious impacts and much more serious disruptions to human life. The big challenge they face is that we found since then that some of the agreements that we made in Paris, the commitments the countries made in Paris probably aren't going to be enough to get to 1.5 and would probably lead to global average warming closer to 2.5, 3 degrees Celsius and would therefore lead to much more severe impacts. So they're getting together and say, what can we do? What kind of new commitments can we make to hopefully bend that number, something back closer to 1.5 degrees?
Obviously, when Donald Trump was president, he pulled out of the Paris Accords. He pulled out of a lot of these climate agreements. Are you getting a sense that something is going to be achieved out of these meetings, or is it just a lot of talk at this point?
I mean, there's certainly a lot of talk, right? There's a lot of talk at these meetings. It's a lot of big diplomatic leaders giving speeches. Something's always accomplished at these meetings, right there. And from the Paris Accords, even though it's clear it's not enough, there's clearly a change in direction in global atmospheric carbon emissions from that. So it's a change in the trajectory. The question is it enough? And that's always the kind of challenge of these big multilateral meetings. You're having countries come from all over the world with different interests, with different levels of responsibility for the problem and different kinds of challenges that they face as a result of climate change. So you're dealing with a big set of compromises where some countries are all on board because they're facing the impacts of climate change right now. And other countries whose economies are dependent upon fossil fuels, much more hesitant to make meaningful commitments. So it's a big deal that the United States is back. It's a super important thing that the United States is back and meaningfully participating in these conversations. But that alone doesn't mean that they're going to meet some of the goals that are set here. From the commitments that are out there now, we probably have bent that number back to maybe 2.4 degrees Celsius. So it's going to take even further commitments, especially from the big industrialized countries of the world that are most responsible for the emissions that cause this problem. Bigger commitments from them to bend that number even further back.
You talk about these commitments, and I know a couple of months ago there was a huge report released on really kind of the state of climate change at that time. Struck a very dire tone in terms of the efforts that we all need to make to try to roll that back. What do some of these changes look like? I mean, are there changes that you've already seen happen that need to continue, and what more needs to be done?
Yeah, I mean, the IPCC's most recent report was an alarming one, right? Some of the changes that we thought would happen further down the road are already happening. Global mean temperature is already probably up about 1.1 degrees since industrialization. So we're already coming close to that 1.5 degree number. And we've already seen kind of evidence globally, and even here in Texas, right, that we're seeing broad scale climatic changes that make life harder for humans and other living things on Earth. So there's the sense from that report that, many of the changes that we thought would be down the road are already happening, and that makes the kind of changes that we need to bring into being right now through COP26 even more urgent. The sense now is that all of the countries need to commit to reducing carbon emissions probably by half within the next decade to even have that 1.5 degree goal within reach, which is an enormous set of changes, right? That requires major changes in the economic organization and the way we produce energy and live our lives in most countries in the world.
Are you seeing that those who deny that climate change is real are kind of fading? I mean, do you think more people are moving towards the realization that this is actually happening?
Yeah, I think that is the case. I think 5 or 10 years ago, I think the big challenge that we faced in communicating climate change was that there were a lot of people who weren't ready to accept it as a fact. I think with better science and better data, and that IPCC report is really an example of the kind of better science and better data, more fuller science that's coming out, it becomes harder to deny it as a fact. And the question is, how do people respond, right? You hear some people respond and say, well, listen, climate change has always happened. There's always been climate variability. So this is nothing new, and we don't need to respond in this way that's super expensive and challenging. But what we know from deep climate science, from the anthropological and archaeological record, is that, yeah, there's been climate change throughout history, but what we're experiencing now is a great deal more intense and more severe. And that climate change in the past, yeah, it happened, and it often wasn't good, right? It happened, it's a fact of the past, but that doesn't mean it's something we want to accept for the present. We have the benefit of the knowledge of some of the impacts that it had on people, drought and famine and political unrest. And with the knowledge of what happened in the past, and with the possibility to really bring about different futures with that knowledge and with the technology that we have, it seems to make a whole lot of sense to work on that. And the challenge is creating the political will to do that. And the spaces like COP26 are one of the places where we have to kind of make that push to do it.
A big challenge, certainly. Patrick Gallagher, Assistant Professor of Anthropology from UTSA. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks so much.
Have a great weekend.